Hello, everyone. Good to see people who are going to learn new things, who are going to learn about new solutions, new ways of being active in local environment. I would like to introduce you our great keynote speaker for the final session of our conference. Artie Garg, PhD, is a person who started and is leading an organization that is gathering locally active researchers to get involved in local government activities and giving knowledge to people who has power to make decisions. That's a great example of cooperation between researchers and local community. And we hope to learn new things, new knowledge about how to do it. Maybe we can do it in Poland. Maybe top 500 innovators could be people who will do it in the future. So you're welcome. Great that you accepted our invitation, Artie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So just to start, decisions are made by those who show up. Every single time I talk about local engagement, I always start with a version of this slide. And the reason is because what I think this quote conveys to all of us is that if we want to have an impact on the decisions that affect our lives, whether they be decisions made by local leaders in our community, whether it be government or anyone else, we have to show up, we have to participate and be part of the conversation. Usually when I talk about this, I talk about it as kind of, it's almost like a nice thing to do or a privilege to show up that I encourage people to exercise. But I've started to think, especially, and I'll talk about this a little bit, with so much going on in our American politics, so much going on in your Polish politics, that I don't know if it's just an option for us anymore who have science and engineering backgrounds. I've come to believe it might be a responsibility for us as scientists and engineers to be active civic participants and to be engaged members of our community. But I also know that this can be hard because, frankly, we're not taught to understand how our identities as a scientist, as a technologist, as an engineer or a mathematician is connected to our identity as a political or civic participant in our country and in our community. So I thought, let's start by talking a little bit about politics. And as an American, I wanted to share with you from my perspective what in the last 20 years or so are some of the most important events in American politics. I realized as I was putting this slide together that it's bookended for an American in a rather uncomfortable way. I started this presentation, and it'll become clearer in a minute, with talking about September 11th. And those attacks on the United States, I think for many Americans really shattered our understanding of what kind of security we had in our country, our ability, our sort of protection geographically from being attacked on our soil. And I think it's taken a long time, but I've come to realize the repercussions of that actually affect all of us, including the work we do as scientists and engineers, because so many of the aftermaths, good and bad, that came from that are directly tied to scientific and technological advancements. On the other end, even as I speak, we are in, at least in my lifetime, probably in at least 100 years, in an unprecedented moment in American politics, where we've had a presidential election. There's broad consensus that there is a winner of that presidential election, who would be Joe Biden, and historically the first woman vice president in the United States, Kamala Harris. But it's contested. And again, for us Americans, this is very unusual. It's a new experience for us. And as a result, I think for a lot of us, it's a very uncomfortable experience of our faith in our democratic institutions not working. I don't think, I'm sharing these events from an American perspective, though I don't think anything on this slide would be surprising to people in Poland and other parts of the world, just because the impacts of what we do in the United States can be so, has such a broad impact on overall geopolitics. And so, I mentioned a little bit that this is connected to our roles as scientists and engineers. And I wanted to, you might be wondering, but why? How? This is just a history lesson of politics. But I wanted to sort of show this in context and to say, and show this back, turn this into a personal story for me to show how this political context, many of these very jarring events, some positive, a lot negative, unfortunately, it is impossible to understand my experience as a scientist, as an engineer, as a technologist, without thinking about that context. So after showing you roughly 20 years of American political life, I wanted to make it a bit more personal and talk about 20 years of my own professional life, my own personal professional life. I did this because I was once told that the best presentations are the ones you make very personal. So here you go. This is my own personal journey. One of the things I mentioned that I started this presentation with September 11th for a reason. That reason is that I began my PhD, the first day of my program was actually September 11th, 2001. I remember I hadn't even gotten an apartment yet. And I was staying with a friend who woke me up early to say, you should come watch the news. And even looking back now, I don't know that if you had just asked me, was September 11th life-changing for you? I think that the reality is I don't know what I would say, but at the same time, I can never actually know what direction my scientific career might have taken, my professional career might have taken, my personal life might have taken if I didn't start my scientific postgraduate studies on that day. If I had started at a different time in a different place, I do believe that different things would have happened in my life. So we cannot escape the political context in which we conduct our science and in which we practice in which we have our engineering and scientific practice. Very specifically, from day one of my scientific education, postgraduate education, it impacted all of the conversations I had with my new classmates. Very practically, again, the travel restrictions impacted, travel restrictions placed in the response to September 11th impacted international students in my program to the point where it was difficult for them to return from abroad where they might have been doing research to defend their PhDs. For myself, and you can see a picture of me, I conducted most of my PhD work in astrophysics at a telescope in Chile. And again, the travel and visa restrictions impacted all of the scientists that I worked with, including my own experience going back and forth, traveling internationally. And so given this context, perhaps it's not surprising at all that a couple years into my program, I decided to take a short break and go to Washington, D.C. This was my first time really thinking not about how can I make my impact in the world as a scientist, but thinking about how can I make my impact in the world just as a person who has a scientific background and but is interested in her broader impact in the world. And I went to Washington, D.C. to do a short fellowship program with the National Academies, which includes the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine. And it was a great experience, a great exposure to start to understand the importance of scientists interacting with decision makers, with government policy makers. This was very focused on government. But then finally, I did return to finish my studies. But soon after I finished my PhD and started my postdoctoral work, we had another historic change in the United States. We elected our first Black American president. And it felt like a big change for our country, especially for me. I'm the child of immigrants, and I'm a person of color. And in the United States, it was rare to see yourself represented in our leadership. So again, perhaps it's not so surprising that I decided to take another break from my work as a scientist and as an engineer and go back to Washington, this time in a little bit longer term permanent capacity. And I started off by working as a fellow in the U.S. Congress, advising a member of Congress. And later I worked in the White House Budget Office, advising essentially helping the president build the strategy for investing in research from the U.S. Department of Energy and scientific research that program invests in. And this was a great experience. But one thing I will say is I was sitting in the epicenter of American civic life. I was sitting in the executive office of the president. But I think at the time I didn't truly understand what it meant to be a civic participant and a scientist at the same time. I viewed it as this was a job I took and my scientific understanding helped inform it. But I still viewed science and public life, civic life as being separate things. And I think that's important, is to recognize that we can even engage in civic life, but not necessarily understand how civic life is connected to our scientific and technical lives. Eventually, for personal reasons as well as professional reasons, I did leave Washington, and I returned to California, where I became a data scientist and, resumed very technical engineering work, working in data and control systems for renewable energy, and later in advanced computing, which is in artificial intelligence, which is now the area where I work in my day job. But a life-changing thing actually happened to me in this during this period, soon after I returned to more formal, more traditional technical work, if you will. And it's simply that I applied to and was appointed to an advisory position, an advisory task force for my local government. It's something I had never considered doing. I didn't really understand what type of impact I could have in my local community, but the opportunity arose, and I missed having any connection to government, so I did. And it really altered my my thinking about what it means to be a scientist and a civic participant. Soon after I joined this task force, I started to realize that even my work in renewable energy was heavily impacted by decisions my local government was making around simple things like permitting for having electrical hookups for solar panels, is just one small example. And so I started to realize that actually more scientists and engineers should be engaging directly with their local governments, because there are important decisions that get made that have scientific and technical circumstances around it, or they're related to science and technology. And so I decided, I wanted to find out, am I the only one? I wanted to create a community so we could learn from each other. And the first thing I decided to do was reach out to the alumni of the program that had originally brought me to Washington. I knew I was not unusual in terms of leaving Washington and deciding to return to technical work, but I thought anyone who had gone to Washington for a short period of time is likely to already be a little bit more motivated around civic engagement. And so surely I must not be the only one. But after reaching out to that alumni organization, what I realized is that I got a number of responses, and a lot of people were very interested in getting engaged in their local governments and getting engaged with their local communities, but very few of them actually had. And so what after a few conversations, what actually emerged was we decided to launch the organization Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. And our mission was really to get people who are engineers and scientists more engaged with their local governments. And I'll talk a little bit more about the program, the organization later, but I want to share a little bit more first about this intersection that I have started to see emerge, especially by spending so much of my time these days, encouraging engineers and scientists to become more engaged locally with their local communities and with their local governments. But before doing that, I do want to sort of step back to this question of how my personal journey and professional journey can't be understood without looking at it through this political lens. And I mentioned already that if you just asked me off guard, I would probably never say that starting my graduate work on September 11th changed the course of my life. But when I look at the data presented this way and how much decisions that I made to veer off the traditional track of scientific research are heavily correlated with major events happening in the world around me, I have to say that the data are at least compelling enough to warrant further investigation. So, I look at something like this, and I encourage all of you to make a map like this. This was actually a fun exercise to put together for this presentation, because even for me, I think I learned a little bit about myself and how I reacted to the political environment in which I live, in which we all operate. And so, I want to ask myself, and I ask all of you, what does this mean? How do we understand what our role is as scientists and engineers in our political context? So I think one way to think about it is using this quote from an American engineer named Bill Nye, who hosts a very popular children's television show called Bill Nye the Science Guy. You may be aware, I don't know, but after President Trump's election in the United States, and actually in many countries across the world as well, many scientists organized marches across the country to protest the denial of scientific evidence, particularly climate science. This was a very controversial thing to do, and I will admit, even I kind of questioned it. But because I was a little worried about, are we going to over politicize what it means to be a science? Are we going to make science seem like something that's just another policy debate or political debate to be had? Bill Nye very famously defended his participation in these science marches by saying that this type of activism cannot be viewed through the lens of American party politics, or really, I think, any party politics. It should be viewed as political. He famously said, "Science is political, not partisan." And I think this resonates with me. As scientists and as engineers, we have a responsibility to engage in political discussions. And for me, as trained as a physicist, this hits particularly close to home. As many of you probably know, in the aftermath of World War II, physicists began organizing for nuclear non-proliferation. We realized what we had unleashed in the world, and we started to realize we have a responsibility. We understand that technology better than others. And that political legacy, especially of physicists getting involved in international politics and international policy related to nuclear issues, lasts today. In fact, myself, this is a legacy that I think informed a lot of our experience as physics students. And I did choose to do my postdoctoral work at a nuclear weapons lab, specifically to focus on non-proliferation projects as part of my research. So I think that it is important to recognize that we cannot separate our scientific selves from our political lives. And just to illustrate that a little bit more, I want to share another story of how science can shape our civic and political life. I want to talk about Bina Agrawal, who's a development economist at the University of Manchester. And incidentally, this is, again, a very personal story again, because Bina Masi is also my maternal aunt. She's my mother's sister. But another important part of her story is that beginning from her doctoral work, she has focused her research on the intersection of gender and property rights. And I think it's actually notable to say that many people, when she was doing her doctoral work, didn't actually consider focusing on the economic status of women as a distinct political or economic player from men to actually be worthy of study. It was a challenge just to say this is worth studying. But through her efforts, which were very much focused on her academic work, a foundation was laid that demonstrated how property ownership was critical to improving women's societal status. And the result of her work was that in 2005, a law was passed in India revising inheritance so that women for the first time were by law given equal rights to inheritance as men. So this is the power, I think, of what we can do through our research, is you cannot separate it from decisions that affect our lives day to day. Even if we think we want to, we can't. Her decision to study women and their economic status was in and of itself controversial. It was political to make that decision. And I think, though, there's another piece of it, which is that it was also personal. It's impossible to understand that why my aunt would have chosen this field of study despite the hurdles if her personal, if it wasn't informed by her own personal identity as a woman. And so I think that brings us to another way to think about ourselves in our political context, which, again, sharing a quote from American feminist Carol Hanisch, who is credited with building this notion, this political concept of the personal is political. And once again, the point is that we can't separate our science from our political context. I think we also cannot separate our personal lives from our political context. I've shown a picture here of children in the United States who are demanding stricter gun laws. This effort, these children are part of an effort that mobilized children across the United States. And what they wanted, what they were demanding was policy action relating to stricter gun laws. But I think that what's important to recognize about this is that this national effort to change our laws was actually started by a small group of teenagers from Florida who had survived a mass shooting in their school. And they decided they no longer wanted to live in fear of gun violence. So it is true that a very small number of people can make a big difference. In this case, children organizing, because it is so personal to them, have made such a difference, have opened the eyes, at least in the United States, I think, of a lot of people for just the impact of our tolerance for gun violence in our schools. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with another child, Greta. It's not even worth saying her last name. Even my 6-year-old daughter knows who she is. She has mobilized children around the world to demand climate action. And her argument is quite simple. For children, this is not just politics. This is about their own personal lives, their future, and what they perceive that to be. So with that, I'll share another story about how really leaning into our political, how our personal lives cannot really be extracted from our political lives. I want to talk about Amy Wilson. She's a technologist and an innovation effort, and also the author of a soon-to-be released book, Empathy for Change. I also recently published an interview with her on the Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally blog. And what's interesting about Amy is that she was, working in her life as a technologist. And in the United States, Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. If you're not aware of it, it was a national disaster that hit the southeast part of the country. And it displaced more than 1 million Americans. It killed nearly 1,800 people. It is probably one of the worst natural disasters from impact in the United States, and also maybe one of the worst emergency responses ever mounted by the United States government. And so Amy was motivated to leave her job and join a public service program in the United States called AmeriCorps, which places, it's run by the national government, but it places anybody, not just scientists and engineers, but anybody in local communities to work on acute efforts. And she joined the AmeriCorps so she could help rebuild the Gulf Coast, which had been destroyed. That led to a complete life change for her. She later joined the President Obama's administration as a Presidential Innovation Fellow. And drawing back on her experience as a technologist and innovator, she launched a government-wide practice of innovation that's built on the principles of technology innovation: agile, human-centered design, and lead startup. And after leaving the White House, or leaving the federal government, she realized, actually, we need to start a little bit more locally. So recently she's brought similar practices to local city government in California, in a city actually neighboring the one in which I live, called Oakland. And Oakland in particular has a large population of Black Americans who have been historically marginalized and sort of left out of discussions that impact their lives. And so by, again, bringing principles that were designed to make apps that are more attractive to users, she was able to work with the government to develop an app to better engage citizens in decision making. And what she told me is, I feel like we have a responsibility as citizens in the world to leave the world a bit better for us being here. And I think that, to me, that really sums up this arc of how our lives as scientists and engineers cannot be untangled from our lives as people who live in a political environment, and just by virtue of being citizens and residents of our countries and our communities, are attached to the political, in which we cannot extract our scientific lives from our political lives, because they just enmesh. They are hopelessly entangled, if you will. And also, it's our personal motivations, though, that really drive us to want to do what we do, whatever it is. And so I think that is kind of the foundation under which I really come to understand the work that we do at Engineers and Scientists in Acting Locally. So very briefly, what is Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally? It's all volunteer, and I stress that because all of us have kids and day jobs and other things that we do. We don't get paid to do this, but we have, there are at least 20 to 25 active volunteers in a national organization, and our only mission is to increase local civic engagement by people with STEM backgrounds. It was launched by a group of us who have some experience in public policy, both at the national level and at the local level. And just to give you an idea, even at the local level, what are some of the government issues local governments are dealing with that might be of interest to people with STEM backgrounds? This is an ICE chart, I admit, so I don't expect you to read the whole thing. And I will also emphasize that this is actually just a subset of issues local governments might be dealing with. But you can see that it's a lot. And at least in the US, our local governments have far less access to scientists and engineers than, say, the national federal government does. And so, as they're making decisions, just pick one randomly, as they're making decisions about how to regulate, for example, autonomous vehicles and all of the impacts that have, whether it be from access to transportation to safety, they really need help. Understanding these technologies. These are some of the most advanced technologies in the world. I know I work in artificial intelligence, and we're still figuring out how to build these autonomous driving platforms. So it's really important, I think, for us as technologists, as scientists, as engineers, to be open to engage with our local decision makers, because it doesn't always have to be adversarial. Sometimes they just need our help. And so, but I think sometimes it can be difficult to know how to help. And I share this because we conducted a survey in 2017 just to understand. One of the things we found was a lot of people said that they were interested in local government engagement and local community engagement, but very small number of people self-reported a lot of direct engagement. In fact, they self-reported more engagement at the national level. And so what we kind of picked up from that is I think one of the biggest challenges is lack of knowledge about what civic participation, especially at the local level, entails. As you can see, one of the most popular answers is that people do not have time for local engagement, but it's simply not. What I found is when you're honest with people about what it entails. For myself, I serve on a city commission now, and I often, I haven't here, but I often share the details of what the required time commitment is. It's 2-hour meeting, monthly 2-hour meetings, 8 times a month, 16 hours. And so I think most people, even with their family lives, even with their work responsibilities, have time for that type of civic participation. And it's really just a lack of knowledge. And so one of the things that we try to do with engineers and scientists acting locally is to break that knowledge barrier by sharing information. We have a blog where we share stories of engineers and scientists who are making difference in their community. We also highlight local organizations that are working at the nexus of STEM and local community and local government. And recently, we launched a series called Deep Dive, where we really dive into the details of STEM-related issues and how they're being, how they intersect with local governments. And very soon I'll be talking, I'll actually be publishing a piece, for example, on monitoring for the SARS-CoV-2 virus and wastewater treatment, which is as complicated technically as it is logistically, to be honest. Other things we do is that we publish resources, including guides, just to demystify the challenges of making the first step, reaching out to your local government. And we also host events. We used to host in-person ones. These days they're more virtual, but really just want to get people to recognize how important it is to be a member of your community as a scientist. Bring your science hat to a community meeting. You might be surprised at what you can contribute. And I also just want to point out that this kind of work, I think, is really important because you never know where, when, and how science and technology might come up. We published in the run-up to the United States election, we started an election integrity page where we shared infographics and facts about elections. And really our goal was just to remind people to vote, and we just thought it would also be interesting. As it turns out, some of the, as we've had this really unexpected outcome in the US election, for many of us are learning about the intricacies of how elections are run at the local level for the first time. And as it turns out, we had highlighted, for example, an important thing that happened in the state of Georgia, which is risk limiting audits, which is a statistical method for sampling ballots. And it turns out that it was good that we were thinking about this because we had actually published an infographic to help people understand what this process was, because I think there was a lot of concern in the United States that that wasn't correct. And so you never know, I guess is the point I want to make, how important even a small thing you might do could be. So, but with that, I just will close and hopefully we have some time for questions. I'll leave you with one last thought. Why is civic participation important? Maybe, at least for me as a mother, the most important thing might simply be that our children are paying attention. This is a poster that my 6-year-old daughter made on her own. She had, occasionally watches the news. Probably we had talked to her a little bit about the protests that were happening in the US and across the country related to racial injustice and mistreatment of Black Americans. And so she went and made this poster and brought it back to us. So if we don't engage in our civic lives, our children still notice and they still ask questions. And at least for me, maybe that's one of the most important reasons why. So with that, I will ask if anyone has any questions. And I think that there's a comment feature and also a microphone feature. Are these hands raised? So I don't see any questions, or am I in the wrong feature? I apologize, I'm just learning this this platform, but if there are questions, I'm not quite sure how to hand the mic over.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. So all participants are welcome to ask questions and join the session. So could you maybe give us some, because maybe we would like to do the same in Poland, and thought what should be the first 2 steps to undertake to start this this initiative?
Yeah. Well, I think that for me, the first couple of steps were actually understanding where people were at. When I first reached out thinking that I wanted to create a network of scientists and engineers who were engaged in local government, I started with the assumption that there were a lot of people who were engaged. And just by trying to talk to the people I already know, communicate with the groups that I already thought would be interested, I learned very quickly that there was more interest than there was knowledge of how to be locally engaged. And so that was the first step, is to recognize that where to start was actually to build knowledge. And then, maybe I am a technologist and familiar with lean startup, and that was the approach we've taken all along, is to try something, always have a hypothesis behind it. So one of the first things we did was start featuring engineers and scientists who we did identify who were locally engaged in our blog. And that kind of built the momentum to, over time, we realized, well, maybe we need to provide some background on how government is structured. Maybe we need to provide some guidebooks on what the right, how to join a city commission, for example.
And the situation is the same in all cities, or how the experiences from one city could be spread to the other local communities?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's something we try to understand every day. So we try to find what the commonalities are between the different city government structures, and then especially now we do training workshops, and we highlight what the differences are, and if we do a workshop that is targeted in a specific region, then we'll try to learn more about that city or that state government so that we can provide more specific information. But it's always a balancing act. And I think one of the things is that we've always approached this with a little bit of humility. We've always said, we don't know everything, we're sharing what we know. And we've sometimes learned from our audience and tried to capture that so that we can share it with others.
Okay, that's great. And maybe it will be last question. What is, because I can imagine that the exchange of knowledge between many local communities could be made in some working groups or some subgroups, because there are some topics that are common. So what working groups, what subgroups in your organization are, and what could you recommend to how to organize in what fields?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. In the U.S., there's a lot of other organizations of engineers and scientists. I imagine there's probably something similar in Poland. So we have, say, the professional societies that are associated with different disciplines. We have some other grassroots scientific organizations that have kind of local chapters. When we started, we thought maybe we would create our own local chapters, but we realized because we were also trying to encourage people to do something they weren't already doing, it was actually better to target other organizations that people were already joining and share the knowledge with them. So, for example, we've recently partnered with the American Chemical Society. We've recently partnered with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We have an upcoming event with the Architectural Enterprise Institute, which is part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And the goal is to people self-select to join these groups because of what their profession is. And so the goal is to help them understand how others in their profession are engaging in their communities.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Arti, for your participation, for your knowledge, which is really valuable, and we hope to use it in next years. So now I invite everyone to join the group fee. So a smart photo made of selfies of each of us who is participating here. So I start the function, and you will see on your screens that is asking for permission, and you can take a photo and use this one. Click these two buttons, and then the system will magically create the group fee. So we will wait several minutes to complete all the participants in the selfie. Okay, so in a minute I will finish it and send you the group fee. I welcome all participants to join to next session for the final conclusions that will be made from our studio here in Wrocław. And yeah, I think everyone who wants to join, there's increasing number. So let's count to 10 and we'll finish. So again, thank you very much, all the participants. Thank you, Arti, for being with us, and hope to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.